Welcome to this webinar, everyone, and I am going to be brief. I'm Lucas Sjostrom, Executive Director at Minnesota Milk. This is part of our conservation series, so if you're watching this, you've probably signed up for that, but don't forget we have 3 other series of webinars, Thursdays and Fridays in January and February that you can watch now live or watch later on. Without further ado, I want to thank Tim and thank Bob for joining us for this webinar, and I'll turn it over to our host, Bob Lefebvre of Midwest Dairy, and appreciate Midwest Dairy's sponsorship of this conservation track series. Thank you, Bob.
Well, thank you, Lucas. And on behalf of Midwest Dairy, we want to thank you for attending today. We know that conservation and sustainability is more important than ever. In fact, 50% of consumers say the pandemic has made them more aware of the environment. We appreciate all of your efforts towards conservation and sustainability and hope you enjoy this webinar. Today we have Tim Raditz with the Minnesota Discovery Farms, who's going to be sharing with us the results and what's been happening there with Minnesota Discovery Farms. So Tim, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks, Bob. Let's see if I can get my screen shared in the correct manner here, figure out our technology. How's everything looking? Can you see my slide, Bob?
Looks good. Looks good.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me here today. Again, my name is Tim Raditz. I work for the Discovery Farms programs in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So I'm actually going to be talking a little bit about Wisconsin as well. Being that they're a big dairy state, we actually have a lot of dairy data in Wisconsin to draw from and help us learn from. So I grew up actually in Winona County, Minnesota, on a dairy farm near Lewiston. So I have a lot of respect for dairy farmers and the work it takes.
Tim, if I can pause you for 1 minute, if you can hit swap displays, we're seeing the presenter view.
That better?
There, perfect now. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for letting me know. But yeah, so I was raised on a dairy farm in Winona County, Minnesota. I'm definitely not tough enough to continue milking cows, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing now. So if we want to talk a little bit about Discovery Farms and what Discovery Farms means, we are a farmer-led water quality research and educational program. And we strive to provide credible research that matters to farmers and conservationists. And we want to communicate those results. That's really important to us, is communicating the results. I think a lot of times studies just get done and nobody talks about them. So we're here to talk about them, and that's part of what we're doing today. So a little bit on the water cycle and what sort of data we're collecting. We focus on edge of field. So our monitoring stations are set up on edges of field, and we're collecting runoff water on a majority of our sites, and then also tile water, which can be substituted for the infiltration in this little picture. Water that moves down through the soil profile to tiles, if you have tiles in where you farm, and off the fields in that way. Those are the 2 main forms of water that we're collecting. We also measure the amount of precipitation and the crops that are growing, so we have some sort of estimates of precipitation and transpiration, so we can get a pretty full water cycle picture. We collect data 365 days a year, which is very important in our upper Midwest climate, because we have this thing called snow and snow melt. And this turns out to be a pretty big, large picture of our water cycle here in Minnesota and Wisconsin. But essentially, we set up our monitoring stations, and whenever water is moving off the field through surface runoff or tile drainage, we're sampling that water for the amount of sediment or soil loss, a couple forms of nitrogen and a couple forms of phosphorus. So we're primarily focused on the nutrients nitrogen and phosphorus, and then soil loss. A big thing that we do is we collect the flow volume, so like number of gallons that flows off a certain field, and then we sample for concentration. And with those 2 different values, we can estimate losses on a pounds per acre basis. So you get a total picture of what's happening. Here's some of the current locations I'll be talking about today. So we've worked across Minnesota and Wisconsin through many of the agricultural areas and worked with a variety of farming systems and a variety of landscapes. Minnesota in particular is very diverse when it comes to moving from southeast Minnesota up to northwest Minnesota in terms of soils, in terms of slopes, in terms of type of farms and crops being grown. It's really a wonderful state to work in. In Minnesota, we've worked with 2 dairies, one in Stearns County, the Meyer Dairy Farm in Stearns County, and the Gross Dairy Farm in Wright County. So those are the 2 dairies we've worked with. We've also worked with a number of hog operations, some straight up cash grain operations, and things like that. In Wisconsin, we've worked with a variety of dairy systems. I would say our sites in Wisconsin are very dairy heavy, just because there's a lot of dairy farms in Wisconsin. Our program is really built on partnerships. Farmers are key to this program. Without their participation on the steering committee that organizes and guides our program in terms of the projects we undertake and the stuff that we're looking at, and also the project participants, so the actual farmers on the ground that we're working with that are making decisions day to day. Their engagement in our program and our farmer engagement in our steering committee is why our Discovery Farms program works. It doesn't work without farmers being involved. Also, our monitoring partners, we don't set up and have farmers or our group collect the data. We work with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and the USGS in Wisconsin to collect the data. So they're leaders in the United States in collecting this edge of field information, and their partnership allows us to have a very high quality, unbiased data source that we can use in our educational efforts. We also partner with numerous local partners across Minnesota and Wisconsin, and a lot of times in Minnesota, these would be our SWCDs, and they're actually the ones collecting water samples from our monitoring sites, maintaining them. They're out shoveling snow when we're going to get snow melt runoff, so they're actually the ones doing all the hard work and making sure these numbers keep coming in. For our Stearns County site at the Meyer Farm, we worked with the Stearns County SWCD, and we worked with the Wright County SWCD at the Gross Family Dairy Farm site. Communicating the results is what we're doing here today. I will also offer up a couple of other opportunities if you're interested in this sort of data. We have been hosting a virtual conference series because of our wonderful COVID times that we're in right now. It was 7 Wednesdays in December and January. We have one more series left next week on Wednesday, but you can find these on our YouTube page or on our mawrc.org/events page. Let's see if I can get my laser pointer here. So this website is where you can find information on all these different events. A couple more events that we're working on coming up would be the Nitrogen Conference here on February 9th. Again, another Zoom event, free event that we're putting on in cooperation with the University of Minnesota Extension Service and also the Department of Agriculture. A week later, we're also doing a nutrient management conference on February 16th, another Zoom event. And again, all these are in cooperation with the Extension Service and the Department of Ag. And if you're interested in any of these topics or would like to see more of what's on the agenda, please visit our website at mawrc.org/events. So if we move into now, what are we doing? We've been doing this for 10 to 20 years. What do we know anyway? And this here is a picture of people that keep me honest at my house. 2 of the 3 people that keep me honest at my house. And a lot of times they have looks on their faces like that, like, why are you telling me to do this? I have to offer a lot of proof to get things done. And so similar to what we're doing here with our Discovery Farms data, what do we know? Well, we know that losses are different than expectations. Depending on what side of the fence you're on, or whether you're a farmer or a water quality professional, you might expect the losses to be very low, very high. Whatever your previous expectations are, the data that we generate is usually different than people's preconceived notions of what the data should look like, and which is good, right? We want to provide scientific data that really defines where some of these numbers and values are at. Continuous improvement is key, and I would say for farming systems, this is especially important. I think farms over the past however many years, ever since we started farming, continuous improvement has been a goal, and people strive for. You know, we want to continue to get it better at what we're doing. There is no perfect system, so no matter if you're injecting manure, surface applying manure, planting cover crops, have a very diverse rotation. There's always places where we can work to improve on our farming systems. And lastly, timing is everything, with most everything in life, but in particularly water quality data. Knowing how to reduce risk at critical time periods and knowing the weather conditions is essential in terms of how we manage around some of these critical time periods and prevent sediment and nutrient loss through our farming systems. If we move into runoff, we all know the very popular bumper sticker, runoff happens. We see these all over. I'm going to start selling them. Just kidding. But runoff happens on all. So we've collected 151 site years of surface runoff data. In 150 out of those 151 years, we measured runoff, right? So runoff happens no matter the farming practice, no matter the setting, and no matter the land use. We live in an area, in a region where we have an excess amount of water. And at certain times of the year, we're going to have runoff. Tile flow also happens. 90 out of 90 site years that we've collected tile flow data, we've monitored tile flow. So if we have tiles, they're going to run. And we don't have a lot of control over how or when these things are going to run. But we do, so Smokey Bears, only you can prevent forest fires. Although we can't prevent runoff and tile flow, we can prevent sediment and nutrient transport with that runoff and tile flow by managing around critical conditions and taking precautions where necessary. The first thing we talk about is the timing intensity of surface runoff and tile flow is much different. This here is a graph of surface runoff on the left here, and each one of these dots is a site year. So ranging in inches from 0 to 20 inches. Surface runoff on the left, tile flow on the right. And so there's a lot of data and a lot of scatter in this data set. This is from across all our Wisconsin and Minnesota discovery farms. But what I want to focus on is this gray box, or the colored box here. This would be the middle 50% of our data set, and is what we would expect a lot of our results to come back in. So if we're talking about surface water runoff, we expect anywhere from 1 to 4 inches a year. That's pretty typical. Tile flow, pretty similar, anywhere from 2 to 7 inches a year is what we expect. What's very different is the intensity of these flows. All that surface runoff happens in 8 days. So that's a lot. So we have these systems sitting out there 365 days a year, every day of the year, but really we're only collecting, they're only working for 8 out of that 365 days. Tile flow is much different. It's much slower and gradual. All that flow happens in about half a year, 174 days on average. And the timing of when that flow happens is much different as well. Surface runoff, about half of our flow happens during the non-frozen ground, and half of our flow happens during the frozen ground, which would be the time coming up here. So we're reaching the end of January. As we move into February and further into March, this is typically when that frozen ground runoff period happens. And this is very important for our region, and very unique to our region, right? You're not going to see these type of numbers in as we move further south. So it's very important to know the differences between these two fractions and how we manage around that frozen ground time period, and then also the non-frozen ground time period. If we think about soil loss, our soil loss mostly occurs with surface runoff. Again, here's a graph of annual soil loss ranging from 0 to 8,000 pounds per acre. And we have a very high scatter. But if you can see that gray box again that I was referencing before, where the middle portion of our data set is, ranges from 3 to 375 pounds per acre. So a majority of our sites are less than 500 pounds per acre. And I think our average is somewhere around 150 pounds per acre. To put this in perspective, I think this is a really good number and something farmers can be very proud of. 150 pounds per acre of soil loss is anywhere from 3 to 5 5-gallon pails full of soil per football field. So it might sound like a big number. It really isn't. That's a really good number. What we're looking at is trying to find areas where we can get these higher sites down to that value. If we can all be in that area, we're doing a very good job. And so as you can see, surface runoff dominates this. Tile drainage, we just don't get much soil loss moving through tile drainage. So those are important things to know if we're looking at what source of water to protect when we're looking at mitigating soil loss. So soil loss occurs in the spring before crop canopy. So when do we see most of our soil loss? May, June, and July, 76% of our soil loss occurs. And this is the perfect combination of vulnerable fields and intense storm events, right? As we move into the later spring and into summer, we get more of those thunderstorm events, more of those intense rainfall events. And if we're not having enough soil protection or cover during that time period, that's when we can see soil to start to move. You know, to move a lot of soil, we need that energy from the raindrop impact, those really intense rainstorms, and their ability, if they're hitting bare soil during that time period, is when we're going to see a majority of our soil loss. We can reduce this, and a lot of farmers have, as we've documented through our data set, by providing protection during this critical time period. And that protection can be in a form of a living cover crop, perennial crop, or increased residue on the soil surface. Just anything that protects that bare soil surface during that time period is very important. But the level of protection is needed is also very site specific, right? If we're in Southeast Minnesota, where we have more slope, silt loam soils, your level of protection is going to be very different than if we're up in Northwest Minnesota and you're flat as a pancake and you don't have much slope to move that water over the surface. So how do we know whether we have enough protection, right? We can look at a picture like this. We have high slopes. That's going to need more protection than, as I was talking a bit before, if we're flat as a pancake. So what do we recommend for farmers and folks to do to really determine if we have enough soil protection during that time period? Take a drive during that May, June, July, after large storm events. Watch where water flows, look for sedimentation in corners, soil covered plants, rills moving down the fields, any of those things. This is a very visual sort of problem. So if we're seeing those maybe every so often, every 10 years, just a really big storm event, maybe not a big concern. But if we're seeing those year after year after year, we really need to look at ways we can either reduce our tillage or switch up our cropping system so we can add more soil protection during that May, June, and July time period. If we look at tile and look at soil movement through tile, there's not a lot, but we did have some tile sites that had some higher concentrations of soil in the water. And so this is a graph showing each of our sites we've worked with from left to right the concentration of sediment in each of those tile lines. And there's a definite break here where we see very low soil concentration in that tile water on the left and higher concentrations on the right. And the main difference between these two sets of sites is the type of tile used in these tile systems. Every system on the left was corrugated plastic tile, newer updated tile systems, and all these sites on the right were older plastic tile or cement tile or clay tile, and some with identified blowouts, spaces where they cause some cave-ins. So if we're looking at protecting soil moving through that tile system, just updating and maintaining our tile systems is really going to take care of that problem for us. As we move into phosphorus, phosphorus loss mainly occurs with surface runoff. There were a few tile sites that had elevated losses, but mostly we're concerned with looking at surface runoff. And here's again that similar graph as to what I've been showing for runoff and soil loss. Each of these data points is a site year of data across Minnesota and Wisconsin. So our typical range is anywhere from 0.5 to 2 pounds per acre. And as we look at the type of phosphorus that is, it's very important when we're looking at ways to slow down that phosphorus source. Traditionally, it was thought in agricultural runoff that most of the phosphorus was attached to soil particles, so that if we stopped that soil loss, we would in turn stop the phosphorus loss. We have documented in our program throughout Minnesota and Wisconsin that almost 50% of that phosphorus that we've monitored is in the dissolved form. And really stopping soil loss is not going to affect that portion of phosphorus loss. There's different things we need to do to stop that portion of phosphorus loss. And that dissolved fraction has a lot to do with our wintertime runoff and snowmelt component. If we look at our two time periods for phosphorus loss, we can see there's kind of a two-humped time frame where we have our spring or our snowmelt time period, that January, February, March, mostly February and March. But during this time, we see primarily most of our dissolved phosphorus moving. And as we move into the May, June, and July time period, whereas another active time for phosphorus movement, most of this is in the particulate form, so attached to soil particles. So as I was talking before, if we can slow down sediment movement during these 3 months, we're going to knock out this particulate phosphorus as well. But the question is, how do we manage this dissolved fraction during our wintertime losses? And there are a few things we can do to address that. So controlling soil losses is just the first step in managing phosphorus loss. If we take a look at our sites and group them into no-till sites and sites with tillage, and looking at, this is a graph of annual soil loss, we can see the no-till sites, boy, they really knock out the high soil loss values, right? They're just, you don't see those values up above 1,000 or even 500 very, very often. And on the tillage side, there are some higher values. There's lots of lower values as well, but it has more values on the higher end. So you would think phosphorus loss would look somewhat similar to that group, but it turns out that if we plot up our total phosphorus loss between these no-till and tillage sites, they're very similar. So even though we're knocking out all of the phosphorus or all of the sediment with our no-till, there still is similar amounts of phosphorus being lost between those two groups of sites. And the difference being we have higher dissolved phosphorus loss on the no-till sites. So how do we manage that? We manage that with rate and placement of phosphorus fertilizer and manure is important for phosphorus movement. In particular, dissolved phosphorus movement. This is a chart displaying dissolved phosphorus concentrations on the y-axis versus soil test phosphorus in the top 6 inches. As that soil test phosphorus increases, so does our likelihood of higher dissolved phosphorus concentrations. So if we're managing for applying at the right rates, and also if we can incorporate some of our nutrients without disturbing our soil in a way where it's going to create excess soil loss, that is also beneficial compared to just applying on the surface. Because we can get that phosphorus down into the root zone where the plants are going to need it. And if it's on top of the soil, it's going to take some work to move that down to the root zone, and it's going to be able to interact with that surface water runoff more frequently. Timing of manure applications is also critical to reducing nutrient movement. This is some data from a dairy farm in Southwest Wisconsin. Looking at 2004, so it's just one snowmelt time period that I'm going to show some data for. Mid-February runoff, 5 inches of snowpack, rain on snow, and we had 3 basins where we were monitoring surface water runoff in. And so 2 of these basins had fall, early winter manure applications, September and November. And then 2 had February manure applications just shortly preceding runoff of 4,000 gallons and 7,000 gallons in these 2 basins. And the outcome is very apparent visually as well. These are samples from the basins with only November and September manure application, that non-winter application, and then samples from that application shortly preceding snowmelt runoff. So just that one decision increased our phosphorus losses by 3 to 4 times at that farm. So timing is also very important when we're talking about reducing phosphorus loss risk. Manure application in the winter is a challenging thing for us. If we look at our this is a chart of frozen soil, just looking at our frozen soil phosphorus losses, lining up every one of our sites and then color coding them by no winter manure application, early winter manure application, and late winter manure application. We can see that the late winter manure application in particular has a higher risk for phosphorus losses than the rest of the sites. So that's a really important time frame that we need to learn how to manage around, and that includes, if we have to apply, let's pick out fields that are less risky for surface runoff. Can we stack it and apply it at a later date? Things like that we should really consider when we're looking at winter manure applications. As we move into nitrogen, this will be the last thing I talk about today. The story flips a little bit in terms of where we're looking at our primarily nitrogen movement. So instead of surface runoff, we're looking at tile flow. And so each one of these dots again is annual nitrogen loss for each site year across Minnesota and Wisconsin. And our typical ranges for tile flow are anywhere from 8 to 37 pounds per acre. And if we plot up all this data, tile flow in inches on the x-axis versus nitrate loss, we can see there's a very strong relationship, linear relationship there. Meaning as we increase our tile flow, we increase our nitrate loss. And there's not, as I was talking about earlier, there's not a lot that we can do to control this tile flow. A lot of it depends on weather conditions and precipitation amounts. And on average, 4 pounds per acre nitrate for every inch of drainage is what we tend to see. But there is a little bit of scatter off this line. And what does the scatter mean? So if we break the same data down into a color-coded chart, we can look at the influence of concentration. And these concentrations in the soil profile of nitrogen or nitrate are what we as farmers and managers have control over, right? We can control the level of nitrate in our tile system. We can't control the amount of flow that we get, but we can control that concentration value in our soil profile. with our nitrogen management programs. And so at 6 inches of drainage, loss can be tripled just by a simple increase in concentration. So instead of being in that 40 to 50 milligrams per liter, if we can move that into that 10 to 20 milligrams per liter, we're going to have a much lower impact in terms of total nitrogen movement. So things that influence this nitrogen concentration are timing and rate of manure and fertilizer applications, and also cropping rotations have a big impact as well. And the value of alfalfa in dairy forage systems is very apparent in this. This here is a chart of one of our sites, and looking at 2011 through 2016, you can see the crop in every year. And we're just plotting up tile sample nitrate concentrations throughout the year. So throughout 2011 and 2012, we had manure applications, spring manure applications, fairly close to when that crop was going to need it. We didn't see a huge jump in nitrate concentrations in the tile line. As we moved into 2013, there was a fall manure application, and then an additional fertilizer application that happened pre-plant, which took our rates up to a little bit higher level. And we did see an impact in terms of the nitrate concentrations in that tile line. And as we moved into 2014, this was actually transitioning back into alfalfa, but we had just an enormous rainfall event. I think it was a 500-year storm that happened right after planting of that alfalfa, and it was just washed out. The crop was washed out and replanted in August or September. So 2014 was really a fallow year. We didn't see much change in terms of nitrate concentrations, but as we got into 2015, when the alfalfa really started to take hold, you can see a steady downward march of that tile nitrate concentration. And as we get into 2016 and in a continuing alfalfa crop, that nitrate concentration really lowered and leveled off.
Tim, we got a question from Art. I think this might have been from the previous slide, but any differences on liquid versus solid manures in terms of runoff?
In terms of that winter manure runoff, we did not find any difference between liquid and solid manure. We had similar results if it was solid as well.
Sure, and Art, if you'd like to explain more, or if I didn't capture it, I can have you talk, but feel free to type more in. Thank you, Tim.
You bet. So when we're talking to farmers about what we can do about tile and nitrate, the risk of tile nitrogen loss, we're really talking about concentration, because that's what we have some control over. And what we're really shooting for in typically our row crop production is that 10 to 15 milligrams per liter in terms of nitrate. And a lot of our tile sites are at that value. If we get into alfalfa, you can see the real benefit of alfalfa is we can really lower that nitrate concentration to below 5. But where we're really looking at focusing are the sites where we're above that 20 parts per million. As we get up into the 30s and 40s and 50s, we really need to assess our nitrogen management. Are we crediting all of our nitrogen sources? Are we taking credits for our manure nitrogen sources? These are situations where we're either applying above crop need or we're not syncing up our timing of application with crop need. So when we get into situations like that, we need to investigate further in how we can bring those nitrate concentrations to a lower level. So to wrap it up today, I have 3 keys to reduce risk of soil and nutrient losses. 1, we can control soil loss by using an appropriate level of soil protection. So this is matching our tillage to our landscape. If we have a much more drastic landscape, we're probably going to need a higher soil protection. And also updating and maintaining our tile systems is really important to prevent that soil movement through our tile systems. For phosphorus, we really need to consider timing and placement of application and make sure we're sampling our soils for phosphorus levels. So we're not building up our soil test phosphorus to a point where we're going to see much higher increased dissolved phosphorus losses. In that winter time period for manure application, we really need to find ways to manage around that. That is very critical for our phosphorus losses as well. For nitrogen, we really need to consider timing and rate of applications to reduce our concentrations of nitrate in that soil profile. So if we're applying at the right rates and right times, we're seeing very good data in terms of nitrogen movement through our tile systems. So with that, I guess I would be open to taking questions if there is some. Thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you, Tim. I was able to tune in, I think, as you know, to one of the earlier Discovery Farms presentations. So I would advocate that conference, that's once a week. You want to remind everyone of when that is again?
Yeah, they're on Wednesdays. So we have one Wednesday left. So if you go to our mawrc.org/events website, you can find registration info on there. And also, if you just want to watch our past ones or look at the agenda and are interested in some topic, all of the past webinars are on our YouTube page, and you can find them there.
Thanks, and I just encourage everyone to check those out because I think they're very well done and have even more information than you heard here. But any questions from anyone? Art, thanks for the question. And I think you kind of captured this at the end, but in your recommendations, well, I guess maybe switching gears, we have new NPDES regulations in Minnesota. And as you see those, and we're actually going to have a conversation further with Warren, do you see anything there that is going to be troublesome, or do you see in terms of number of days of being able to apply manure with some of the restrictions we have based on your data?
Yeah, in fact, we just had our last webinar through Discovery Farms, so this might be of value to your members, included somebody from the MPCA talking about manure regulations. And he included an update on the new permits. And there's going to be some big changes, not this year, I believe he was saying, but they'll come into play next year. So I think it's going to be really important to monitor those, and it's in terms of the number of days and the things precautions you might have to take in the future. It's going to change according to their plans.
All right.
And in particular, I don't remember if exactly. I know winter manure is one of the things for their permits. I think is not allowed, but also I think the big one that I took home from that webinar was manure applications prior to November. I think you have to have a cover crop or some sort of nitrogen management scenario included with those manure applications.
Yeah, I believe that's correct. And I think if anyone on the line is interested, we're going to have a conversation with Warren Formal, who also works with Discovery Farms and Mawrc, and cattlemen and dairy farmers next Wednesday. So if you want to get in touch, we will have that available. Any questions from our attendees? Otherwise, one of the things that we told Tim is, in addition to the live audience, we know this is going to be a resource for people going forward who weren't able to log in today. And so we won't lengthen this any further, Tim, unless there's anything else you want to touch on. I'll give one last chance for people to ask questions. But I think you've just provided a lot of great details here, and the data tells the story. So one last chance.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. Yeah, it's been great, and I always appreciate the time to get our data out, so and we can all learn from it and work on continuous improvement. So there's a lot of good things that are happening out there, no doubt. We're just documenting what's currently happening and identifying areas where we could make some improvements as well. So.
Well, thank you, Tim, and thanks everyone for joining. Have a great day.